Thanks for joining us. Today we will be talking about education with David Clark, who is a civil engineer who manages a clean water program for a consulting firm. We'll discuss everything to do with your personal story on education. Thanks for joining us, David Clark.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So recently, I read a book called Educated, and it stressed the importance of the different types of education in higher education. So I wanted to get into your personal story with education. And so, what was your path with education and specifically higher education?
Well, I can say that from a family standpoint, education was always emphasized as a very important thing. I think both of my parents would have liked to gone further with their post-secondary education. So the idea of going to university after high school was a really important value to them that I learned about as a kid. I went to public schools for elementary, junior high, and high school, and then to the University of Washington for a bachelor's degree in engineering and a master's degree in engineering.
So you decided to pursue higher education because your parents didn't have the opportunity to, or because you personally wanted to pursue a higher education?
That's a good question. I think it was a combination of multiple things. I think my parents would have liked to have been able to go further with their own education, but I think they emphasized how important an education was to the prospects for a high quality of life. And I think I also recognized that intellectually, I wanted that stimulation of a higher education and wanted to learn more.
And what was it like being the first person in your family to pursue a master's degree?
Well, I don't remember that as being any special distinction in my family. I think my parents were certainly proud that I had academic success as an undergraduate and a graduate student. But I think for me, the more important factor there was that I was very interested in what I was studying in engineering. I've always been interested in water, and I was fascinated by the academic studies, the work in the lab, the work in the field, and I still am.
So, what did your parents think about you pursuing a higher education? Was this something that they thought was mandatory, or is this something that you decided to choose for yourself?
Well, I think by the time I was in high school, I understood that I wanted to go further with education. I think I definitely had encouragement from my family to do that. And I think each year I was at the university, it fueled that interest in the subject matter, in learning more and continuing with education. My parents definitely gave me a green light to do that. I think that with some of the things that I was pursuing in engineering, it probably resonated with my mother and father in particular, because my dad's job was an engineering oriented technical field of work, not the same discipline that I'm interested in water, but certainly there are enough parallels there with the electrical work that he did, the work that I do in water, the technical aspects of that, the different engineering disciplines, that I think there was a certain familiarity with that. I also think that, the general probably attitude about studying engineering as I was this was a solid professional pursuit and not an empty one in terms of professional prospects. Although at the time I was at engineering school, it wasn't a major that a lot of people were interested in because I was in Seattle at a real down period for a big engineering company. The Boeing airplane company had just laid off about 100,000 employees. And so being an engineer at that time in the mid 1970s was something that was quite different. I think people's viewpoint on that was quite different than it would be today, where engineering is a major that attracts a lot of attention.
So kind of hopping off of that, I don't mean to call you out for how long ago you graduated college, but times have changed a lot since then. And do you still think it's important for people to pursue a higher education?
Oh, that's a good question. I know that's a topic of discussion now, more broadly in society, but I continue to think it's essential and more essential than ever because the world has become more complex. We're applying more technologies. Things are moving faster. Conditions are changing faster, where we need to adapt in the built environment that we live in more rapidly than ever before. And so the idea that somehow today less education is needed seems to me to be inaccurate. If anything, higher education, more detailed, deeper education is more important than ever.
Okay, so hopping out of just engineering, do you think higher education is mandatory to be successful today?
Well, I think, success is, determined by individuals in different ways. You can think of it in terms of standard of living, economic prospects, and also importantly is fulfillment, because things that are lucrative economically may not be satisfying and sustain your interest. I think I've been fortunate that um, I end up I'm in a profession that affords a high standard of living, which we enjoy, and at the same time, the subject matter is very interesting. And so, I think there's an old saying that if you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life. And I've enjoyed being passionate about my area of work.
Great, thanks for the feedback. So, on the other hand, while you kind of went into success and how it's up to kind of a personal standard of what success looks like for each person, do you think higher education is mandatory to be successful, specifically in your career of engineering?
Yes, for engineering, absolutely. I think the reason is because the most interesting roles, the most significant responsibilities, the most exciting opportunities come to those that are the best educated, the most sophisticated, technically creative from an innovative standpoint. That's where the exciting work and the roles that are the most fun come from.
Okay, so I know we kind of touched on this earlier, but how do you think education is changing today?
Well, okay, changes in education. I mean, I think one thing comes to mind immediately is that um, the affordability for post-secondary education has become a much bigger issue than I remember it being when I was a kid and when I was in college. The cost of higher education now is a much bigger factor and a much greater impediment or hurdle, I think, for many people across the country than it was when I was a kid. I had modest jobs in high school. I was able to earn enough money to attend a major university. And that was because the state legislature funded education to a much higher degree than states now support post secondary education. And so that made tuition very affordable. And now I think that's much more challenging. Cost of living has increased. So the combination of tuition and fees and living expenses for attending university now, I think, are much more challenging for families. That's the general impression that I have across the country. It's also my specific experience with kids going to college. And I'll just say that although you mentioned it was a long time ago that I went to college, I paid $125 a quarter for the University of Washington. And, even then, $124, it seemed like a lot of money, but it was really very easily attainable,
So, as
working for
Americans,
wages
do you
in a
think we're
grocery
headed
store.
in a good direction to allow everybody to pursue a higher education, cost wise and money wise?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think it's a public policy issue across the country. And no, I don't think that we're being nearly as supportive of advanced education as we should be. From a public policy standpoint, I think it would be important that our state legislators support post-secondary education to a much higher degree, subsidize that education to a much higher degree than we have evolved to at this point. I think to get back to something that maybe we had 40 years ago that makes it much more easily attainable for families to help their kids go to college is an important investment in the long-term future of the country, of the economy. And that's where the innovation and ideas come from that fuel our economic prospects in this country. And so it's very short-sighted to underfund those opportunities, and it limits our potential in individual states and across this country to underinvest in education.
So, as time has gone on, technology has become way more predominant, especially in the workplace and in school. So, how do you think education has grown through technology since you've gone to school?
Well, good question again. I think things have, I would say, accelerated, have become more productive and more intense as a result of technologies. I think we've just been through a period with the COVID pandemic that's demonstrated that a lot of the technologies that we use that boost productivity have vastly increased productivity over the last 40 years now allow us to increase the intensity of our work efforts and our economic productivity even more because we've discovered that it's possible to avoid time sitting in cars and commuting, work immediately from our homes using meetings like this in Zoom, applying technology in ways, again, that allows us to squeeze more productivity out of every hour of the day.
Now, you would say you use more technology now in your job than you did when you were pursuing your higher education. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, vastly more. When I was attending university, it was controversial to have a handheld calculator. There were rules about using a handheld calculator in an exam. The computers that we used in school were mainframe computers with punch cards for our programming. That's technology that came out of World War II from IBM with punch card readers. We're beyond all those things, and you can do more now with your iPhone than we could do on a mainframe computer at the university in the 1970s.
So, we've gone through how technology has gotten way more predominant in life, specifically in your job. So, have you had to learn new skills for your job today that you were not provided in your higher education or educational career?
Yes, I think for sure. And I think that's probably a given or should be an expectation that you're always going to be or need to be a continuing learner to master new skills and learn how to use new tools as they become available. The world isn't static. I think that technology is accelerating the changes in providing new tools and new challenges and raising expectations for what everyone can do.
Well, thank you so much for coming on here today and talking about your education and your higher education.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure to visit with you, and I hope that you will pursue your education as far as you can.
To recap, education has immensely changed over the last few years and will continue to develop and grow. Something that surprised me in my interview was how David acknowledged that as humans we must adapt and develop as the world does also. A key takeaway that I'm walking away with after my interview with David is that even though I may think I understand education, I really don't fully understand it. Education looks different for every person and is changing every day. We must continually adapt. Thank you so much for tuning in to learn a little bit more about education.